A lot of information. I took some notes, but there was a question that I had in my mind. You concluded with the bright side, and I like it. But let's make a step back to the problems, the issues of journalism today. So I'm thinking my generation. I grew up with the myth of the journalist. I'm thinking about Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman in the Watergate scandal, in the famous movie, the two heroes who makes the US government accountable to the world with their investigation. And I'm pretty sure that if I ask to my nephew, she's 6 years old, she already has clear in mind Greta Thunberg. So a girl, an activist, who is now the hero, someone who's bringing this message of changing the world. So in such a messed up world, would you say that, how can journalists can be perceived as the new, as those who can bring change, as activists are now perceived? Because I agree with you, there is a difference between the two, but compared with the past, I don't see many examples of brave journalists. There's a lot of brave journalists, but I don't see many global examples of brave journalists who are making this world better. What do you think?
Well, I'm convinced nobody would know Greta Thunberg if there was no journalism, because I mean journalists are the ones, who amplify her message. I mean, she could, if she wrote just a blog post, if there were no cameras, if there were no interviews, I bet people wouldn't know her. So it's still very important to have, voices. You need the voices, but it's still very important to have the organizations who make sense of these voices, because otherwise she would be just drowned out in a cacophony of voices.
Brings me to a second question. You mentioned a few times artificial intelligence. Okay, so I read about these robots that are now capable of writing articles as good as journalists. I don't believe so, but they are getting closer to that. And there are increasingly platforms with algorithms, web platforms, that promise to activists they could target the population, and they could draft and suggest the best strategy to advocate for a certain reasons. So my question is, are we leading to a world where both journalists and activists will be, if not replaced, but still they will have to work with algorithms that will write articles and share information and will also play the role of activists?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, there are two things here. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to outsource stuff to robots, because I grew up as a journalist for a news agency, Deutsche Presseagentur, German press agency, and I spent so much time writing, just these whatever really easy to do earnings report stuff that I would have loved a robot to have a robot to write, because I could have spent I could have put my energy and my time much better in interviewing people or leading conversations where instead of just sitting at my laptop hammering away. Or did I even have a laptop back then? I think I did. I'm not that old. It was very different back then, but I mean still. So I don't really, I don't have anything against robot journalism as long as it frees up capacity for journalists to do the real stuff, investigations, or to come up with great ideas, great projects in the meantime, when they're not consumed with doing all the regular routine stuff. So I really like that. If it's a supplement, if it's complementing each other, if it's replacing journalists, obviously, that's a very bad thing for society and democracy. And some publishers might think, this is the way to go, to just have a newsroom run by robots. That would be really the worst. But the other question you had is so much more, this is really interesting about the relationship between journalists and activists. If you have activists who have, artificial intelligence helping them, selling their message the best possible way, well, what's the difference to advertising then? And I mean, I think that's an important thing here. Journalism is not advertising, but some people might take it for advertising. Journalism is still there to sort of have, at least to try to present a different view, to present an opposite viewpoint, to listen to several sides and to help the audience make up their minds by themselves. But if you have just activism and you have certain messages, obviously you can find ways to really sell them to the particular audiences that are most susceptible. But I would think this is dangerous, and that's why it's so important to really do something to protect quality journalism that has certain rules and ethical standards to conserve.
Journalism, can you describe us what it takes to be a qualitative journalist?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I'm actually the vice chair of the Committee of Quality Journalism in the Digital Age in the Council of Europe, and when I was elected to be that, and I went to Strasbourg for the very first time, and then one in our group said, "Well, actually, I don't really like the title, quality journalism." And I was like, I used to work for media organizations. I grew up in quality journalism, and I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. What's quality journalism? But the longer I thought about this, actually, the more interesting I found that question was. And in fact, we spent 1.5 days debating what is quality journalism, and I think we're still not done yet, because obviously you can use the label quality journalism also as a weapon or for censorship. You can say, if you are a government and you feel like this is a publication that's too critical and you don't agree with them, then you can say, oh, this is not quality journalism. They don't get a license, or we just say they're fake news. This is not quality journalism. So I've really my conviction really is that quality journalism is never a single piece of content or a story or a text or whatever. Quality journalism can always only be a process, a certain set of rules that need to be applied to content and in a news organization, and there are ethical standards that are connected to that. So everybody knows in all big major news organizations there's a lot of bad journalism. So quality journalism and bad journalism are not the same. Quality journalism is something when there's at least some rules, for example, to have second sources for certain things, or to have a second pair of eyes at least to look on something, and you have ethical standards that guide that organization, that journalism, to obtain the best possible version of the truth. I think that's what Carl Bernstein said, or what, I don't know. I can't. Anyway, but that's quality journalism, and it's not a single great story that you enjoy reading.
So that I spent almost all of my week in Brussels, and for years in Brussels we had this idea that there were on one side business companies, powerful with money, that could influence the decision making, and on the other side the poor civil society actors without resources that were struggling to be influential. And over the years now people are starting to realize that there's many civil society actors that can create alliances, then they can build a profitable model that can also be very influential. Now, you concluded by mentioning among the challenges the market. So how do we make a market of communication and journalism that is profitable? How do you see, what is a model of journalism that is profitable, that is qualitative, but also profitable in terms of resources?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who can afford it or is in the right environment is currently going for subscriptions or donations or anything where the money comes actually from the audiences, from the readers, the viewers, because that's the best way to make sure that journalism is independent from big, powerful interests. Now, I realize, or you have to realize that this is not a model that works for everyone. And there have always been powerful individuals owning publishing companies. They've always been, big moneyed interests. Like think about Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post, and this is probably one of the most progressive and profitable news organizations that there are. I just think that what is really important for an organization is to establish at least some sort of independence and ideally a variety of funding, because the more different sources of funding you have, the better it is to be independent and to order. Or alternatively, I mean, having Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post, you better make sure that he doesn't interfere with what kind of content you are producing. Now, this is easier said than done, and Marty Baron, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, is actually in our advisory board, and he really says, like, no, Jeff Bezos is great, he has never interfered with our content. Then again, well, you can also have this, you know, as a journalist working for the Washington Post, you probably think twice before you do a story on Jeff Bezos and you know, his fortune and whatever, his divorce, that's the latest thing. So it's not even have to do some direct influence. Jeff Bezos probably wouldn't really want to do that, just, you know, walking up to Marty Baron and tell him you don't report on this one. But, you know, in the back of their minds, many journalists probably have the awareness. So it's much better if you get your funding from a variety of sources, as the Washington Post also does. Like, you have digital subscriptions. The news organization that does it best currently is the New York Times, with selling digital subscriptions, and that's really where the industry trend goes. Some others might not have that choice, so there might be crowdfunding efforts. There might be, still local newspapers going back to whatever, local advertising or philanthropy. I mean, there are different ways, but getting your money from your audience is probably the safest way to, you know, be independent.
Would you say that the Guardian's model of free access to all content is doomed? It's going to fail?
Well, the Guardian is about to break even right as we speak after quite a few years of deep losses, and they give you free access, but I don't know if you're readers of The Guardian, you are constantly reminded, you know, if you enjoyed this, please give us your money. And actually that approach works quite well. Interestingly, The Guardian, that is a UK news organization, gets most of its donations, or at least in terms of volume, from the US, where it's also read, because Americans tend to be more generous. I mean, that's a cultural thing. Europeans tend to pay more taxes. Americans tend to be more generous in terms of donations and giving away voluntarily. So this actually works for The Guardian, and that's really important. Every news organization has to look where they're operating in, which cultural environment, or, you know, as I said before, if you're operating in an environment where you're sort of protected by language, it's easier. If you have lots of competition, it's harder. And it also has to fit the needs of your audience. And when you were The Guardian and you told people year in, year out, you know, you can access journalism for free and this is democratic and whatever, then you can't just, you know, it's hard. You could, but it's hard to just, you know, pull the lever and say, oh, tomorrow it's going to cost you. You have to find a way around that. And that's a nice workaround they found. And at least they're breaking even. I mean, are they back on their road to huge profits? Let's see.
I'd like to go back for a second to what you mentioned before about the trust, the idea of trust. So during my classes, I tried to explain to students how civil society is important for a healthy democracy, but then I challenged them by showing case studies where advocacy campaigns have been based on completely biased information. How can a journalist help that? How can a media professional can help the public to understand where is the truth? In a situation where 29% disengage from news, the other astonishing number, 51%, only 51% believes in the news that they decided to read. So I see the other 49 say, okay, I read the New York Times, but I do not believe in the New York Times. And so how can journalism help that to make the public more aware of where the truth is?
Yeah, I mean, these audiences might not believe everything that's in the New York Times, which is okay, but they might believe certain journalists or certain sections, like I believe, I trust the science section, but I don't trust so, I mean, that's a little bit, it's always difficult to have these average numbers, but still, increasing credibility is really important. And I think journalists, they just made the mistake for way too long, not ever to explain how they go about their work, that there's actually a set of rules and standards that they are following, and that it's not just them sitting in their, offices, hammering away at their laptops, but they have to consult second sources, that, they have fact-checking in case that's available. Many news organizations can't afford that luxury, that they have colleagues who check their stories, that they have an editing process, whatever. And it really, really helps. And when I was at Süddeutsche, I was managing editor, I told you, I think, and I did a lot of newsroom tours with different groups and audiences, and I was always surprised how little people actually knew about journalism. So it's really a matter of increasing media literacy and telling people how important journalism, independent journalism is, because obviously with advocacy campaigns, activism, obviously activists have to believe in the stuff they're, passionate about, and very often they don't they don't report all the facts because they have a mission, they have to get donations, whatever, so they really have to work hard on that message. But the journalist's job is to sort of lean back a bit, keep a distance, and look into this, does it make sense? Is this really true? Could there be a counter argument? And that's a great value for society, and that's really important. And to make audiences, people understand that there's a big value in journalism is really vital, and I believe in that as a journalist and as a citizen too.
Perhaps we can ask since our time is running out. First of all, let me thank you for coming here. It was very, very interesting. A lot of insights from two words that are not that different, in my opinion. The journalism, the activism, there are differences, but many things that have in common. We've been mentioning talent, education, storytelling for democracy, definitions, big players' roles in journalism versus those who do a daily job without being necessarily famous. If you will have to give a piece of advice to someone who would like to start a career as a journalist, what would you suggest?
Very easy. You have to really want it. Don't expect to get rich financially, but expect to have an interesting life, and I'm absolutely sure you'll make it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.